I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up and Holler. On this week's episode, we'll cover the first three kickoff times that have been announced, the most frustrating Gator player of our recollection, recruiting to draft numbers. Will's got an interesting theory on that we got some other numbers to back it up. We'll see how it goes. And then over-under win total and national championship odds for the 2021 Florida Gators. But first, we hope everyone had a great Memorial Day yesterday. Will, you got the hat on, rocking some patriotic pride, man. Hope you had a good Memorial Day weekend.
Yeah, man, you too. Obviously, this is a time to sort of reflect and think about all the people who've sacrificed for us. Because at least for me, I wasn't brave enough to go and fight. And so, my grandfathers were, but obviously they did that so that we didn't have to. And I'm very appreciative of the sacrifice they made, and also the ultimate sacrifice that other people have made in furtherance of the ideals of this country. So it's the least we can do is sort of take a moment, stop and say thank you. And there are families out there who this isn't a holiday, this is something that is a sad day for them, and certainly want to make sure that we send out our prayers to them.
Absolutely. And well said, by the way. Well said. And thank you for everyone who has served, and definitely those who have made the greatest sacrifice for our country. All right, let's jump into 2 bits. Will, the first 3 games have been the first 3 kickoff times have been announced. Game 1, Under the Lights in the Swamp at 7:30 p.m. It's going to be on the SEC Network. Willie Taggart and FAU come to town. And hey, on the one hand, love opening Under the Lights at the Swamp. All right, it's going to be a packed house. We're going to get to see the Tom Petty with the lights, with the phones. That's always a good look at night and everything. It's going to head-to-head, though, with the likes of Georgia, Clemson. LSU's going out west to play UCLA. And it's one of those things where I get frustrated with college football. I feel like this has been happening more and more the last few years, where they're just kind of stacking these games all together. And I feel like it's going to get playing FAU is not going to get you a ton of national attention anyway, but I think the Gators definitely could get a little bit overlooked on a national level, unfortunately, with those kind of games going head-to-head. But I'd like to see him spread some love throughout the day, because outside of Penn State, Wisconsin, and Bama and Miami at 3:30, the next best game between the 12 o'clock and 3:30 windows is Iowa and Indiana, maybe?
I'm used to at noon on the opening week of college football not having to pay any attention because it's just the Big Ten. So I'm fine ignoring the fact that Ohio State's going to blitz somebody by 65 points in their opening game, and basically they're going to establish that they're the favorites for the Big Ten and represent the Big Ten either in the playoff, or they're going to lose 1 or 2 along the way and get left out. I mean, there's not a whole lot of question in the Big Ten, and that's normally what comes at noon. And then you obviously get the SEC game at 3:30, though not always on opening weekend, which is why this sort of gets stacked late in the evening. But you don't want to play a game in the Swamp in September at noon or 3:30.
Yeah,
it's hot.
It's
hot. You and I have both sat in those 3:30 games that got the CBS time slot where you go in, especially back when Tennessee was like a legitimate program. And you sit there in the stands and you're just molting, and it's so hot. And that used to be they let you outside of the stadium so you could drink at halftime and come back. And I'm convinced they just did that so people wouldn't die coming back in on the second half in one of those 3:30 games in September.
Well, 3:30 is different because at least the sun will go down at some point. Like, that's at least you get some relief in the second half. Those noon games are brutal, though. And but I just did want to point out nearly half of the currently scheduled games are kicking off at 7 o'clock or later that night. So a little bit of question mark to the college football schedulers. For me, I like watching as many games as possible, but we'll definitely be tuning in there. 7:30 SEC Network against FAU on opening night. All right, game 2, Will, is noon at USF. Raymond James Stadium, home of the Super Bowl champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Hey, it's really the best USF can hope for, I think. In this, maybe a sleepy start from the Gators on a noon kickoff. Really, best case scenario for them. Going to be super hot, like you mentioned, still. But really, I think this could be the first time that a national audience gets a chance to see Emory Jones as the quarterback. And it's going to be an opportunity for the Gators. They're going to be playing on ABC in this game. Ohio State and Oregon, it's going to be going head-to-head. That should be a night game, by the way. But that's going to be a noon game, but that big noon Fox kickoff. But, I feel like I think the Buckeyes might even make good work of Oregon, and people might tune in and see what Emory Jones and the Gators are about if that game's a runaway. on a
You know,
national level.
I mean, from a polling perspective, the 7:30 start you were complaining about the week earlier might be good because you sort of lay under the radar, and then you come in and play this noon game, and you've kind of gotten all the kinks out against FAU, and you're able to hopefully be really sort of motoring along there for the second game. But I mean, the average high in Tampa in September is like 89 degrees. The humidity is just awful. Now, granted, it's going to be filled with Gator fans. I don't think there's any doubt that Raymond James is going to be like 90-10 in favor of Florida. And so it's really, even though it's a home game for USF, it's really a home game for Florida. So that was going to be kind of unique, right? Just so that it's in Tampa. So it's so close to so many Florida alums, and you know, I guess they're taking care of some of those Florida alums. The older Florida alums maybe can go to this game because you know, they will have had to get up at 8 a.m. to drink sufficiently for this one.
Game 3 back in Gainesville against Alabama, 3:30 CBS. Like I said, you get that relief in the second half at least. But hey, it's Bama. I hope it's brutal. I hope it's brutally hot. Let's see if we can get some kind of advantage on Bama in the swamp there. But I love the 3:30 time slot for CBS. I don't take those for granted anymore. Great chance at college game days on campus as well. Really, the only other game I can think of on the schedule is Auburn goes to Penn State that night. That's a pretty cool matchup that you don't get very often, but I don't think that's as significant as Bama coming into the swamp.
Well, I mean, obviously, it depends on how Florida looks in its first couple of games. If Florida ekes out some wins, then maybe game day doesn't see that one as a big deal. Or if, you know, God forbid something happens and there's an upset there before that Alabama game coming in. But, you know, this one had to be at 3:30 because CBS wasn't going to flex to their late night game this early in the season. But clearly, this is the marquee SEC game. So those marquee SEC games used to be Florida, Tennessee, got those. But since Tennessee hasn't won a game against any of its big rivals in like 20 years, now you get the Florida Alabama game gets that treatment early in the year. It's one of those things where it sets the tone, obviously, and you know, Florida can pull one out against Alabama, then it says a lot about the season very early on. It's not very usual that you get one of these games real early in the season where you go, okay, this tells us exactly how good we are. But Alabama, third week of the season, that tells you exactly how good you are.
It only took 2 decades to figure out that Tennessee should be flexed out of that 3:30 spot, huh? on that opening SEC opener against Florida. But hey, Bama coming in for the SEC opener. You know, we're going to be chomping at the bit to see that one. And again, full stadiums fired up to see like regular college football going on here this fall. All right, we're going to move on to 4 bits. This one comes from Twitter. The Super 70s Sports account asked, who was your all-time least favorite player on your favorite team? And Twitter user Mike Henry, he ended up tagging you, Gator Dave, and Uncle Silk in this one. He says, we need to discuss this question. He threw out Andre DeBose as his. I remember DeBose had a long career with Florida. Never quite. I feel like we had a few years where every big player that came in, oh, this is the next Percy Harvin. And then we just kind of realized, oh, there's never going to be a next Percy Harvin. That's kind of a unique dude right there. Like, we got to stop saying that. But Will, I'm going to kick this over to you first. We rephrased it. We said our most frustrating Gator of all time. What's your choice?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously were able to go back and list a bunch when we were sort of previewing this back and forth. But the one who jumps to mind for me is Brock Berlin. I mean, he was the 5-star guy coming in, doesn't win the job over Rex Grossman. Grossman almost wins the Heisman there in 2001. 2002, not quite as good, but Berlin transfers out, then goes to Miami that year in 2002 and leads the big comeback for the Hurricanes against the Gators. Gators raced way out in front. I believe that game was down in Miami, and then Miami was able to come all the way back and win that game, sort of in what was a preview for the Ron Zook era there. We got to see with Brock Berlin. So I was there at school when this was going on, 2002. I still had 3 more years of eligibility there at the University of Florida. We were excited about that 2002 year, especially coming off of 2001. And Brock Berlin, he's the one who frustrated me when he was a Florida Gator because he was that 5-star guy who couldn't really get on the field, and then frustrated me when he was no longer a Florida Gator because he was able to lead Miami to the win.
And that was about his shining moment at Miami too, right? That was his height of his Miami Hurricane career. Of course, came at the expense of the Florida Gators. That was difficult to swallow.
I mean, that'd be like if Tate Martell led Miami against Ohio State and then just was terrible the rest of the way. That's basically what that would be like. So.
I think Tate Martell might be the answer to this question of a Miami Hurricanes podcast. Maybe he might be up the candidate for that. I'm going to go a little off the radar, and this is not a knock on the guy himself. It's more of what he represented to me. And I'm going to go with Ronald Powell. He comes in 2010, and again, this is not so much a specific shot at Powell as is what his time at UF represented. He's the top-ranked player of the top-ranked recruiting class in 2010, but it just did not live up to its promise. And really, it represented the beginning of the end of that Meyer dynasty that was so good. And it just a lot of frustration in those years. But again, I can't totally blame players for the program, shifting tectonically underneath their feet. That's not their fault necessarily. And there were some great players from that class. Will, I mean, you got Dominique Easley, Sharif Floyd, Matt Elam, Josh Shaw. Trey Burton was in that class, but Powell comes in 6'4", 245 weak side defensive end out of California, number one ranked player in the country by 24/7 Sports. Freshman all ACC, 25 tackles, appeared in all 13 games, looks good. Promising sophomore season, gets 6 sacks, but then he suffers a torn ACL in the spring game, re-injures the knee in the fall, 2012, and gets a medical red shirt. Plays 12 games and posts 4 sacks as a junior. He honestly was probably one of the better players on that 2013 team, which of course we know was, I believe that's the last year of Mustang. That was a rough season. But he gets the courage award for battling back that season on the team. So the team recognized that he did a good job. But at this point in career in the NFL, drafted by the Saints in the 5th round, really only played effectively one season of NFL football. So much potential and so much disappointment, and that was a very representative of that time for me as a Florida Gator fan.
It's funny that you'd pick Powell for that era, because really it's like any quarterback of the Muschamp or McElwain era sort of fits that bill more. I mean, you had mentioned Greer in our conversation. Will Greer, obviously the frustration with the PED test. Treon has a good year the year before, and then
it almost felt mean picking Treon, because some of those guys have had enough. Like where Powell, I never had faith that Treon was going to lead us somewhere. Whereas those 10 guys came in. Powell was, that guy was sick. I mean, that's the type of guy you see go top 5. If he has a good career, he ends up more like a top 5 NFL pick, right? A guy with that type of. But I had expectations with Powell. I had expectations with that group.
He didn't have some giant gaff. He didn't throw a shoe. He wasn't. Like whether it was Skylar Morenwig, Tyler Murphy, Jeff Driscoll, John Brantley, Will Greer played well, but then gets suspended. Treon Harris. I mean, no matter who it was, Luke Del Rio maybe fits that mold where you're frustrated with
just keep naming quarterbacks. I'm with you on the frustration there on the quarterbacks, but I'm talking, I didn't think Luke Del Rio. Oh, we're going all the way, baby. We got Luke Del Rio starting this. Skylar Mortwig. Oh, yeah. I was never on board that those guys were leading us somewhere. This is the number one recruit in the number one class. And that's really, I mean, it's unfair to Powell to throw his name out there specifically, but it's for what it represents. I had a lot of hope in that time, a lot of hope in that class. And 2012 was a good season, by the way. And the one season that he missed, by the way, there. And he played okay. Like, I mean, as an individual player, he was okay, but just that was a very frustrating time, like dealing with the downfall. By Jim McElwain's time, we had already been down for a couple seasons. And so those guys, like, they need to earn my faith back. And now I had no expectation during the McElwain era.
I like how just a lack of complete expectations is what kept you from being frustrated. That's good, because the rest of us were frustrated during those 10 years.
I mean, I think my highlight of the McElwain era was him getting mad at Kelvin Taylor after the touchdown. Like, I was like, oh, this guy isn't just like chuckling. He's just not doing that all the time. Every year. Isn't this great? Isn't this place great at Florida? Yeah, dude, you're at Florida. It's fantastic. You don't need to say that every interview.
My highlight was his response to the shark photograph. I mean, at that point you knew he was done, because it's just like, dude, just laugh it off. Like, laugh at yourself. It's not that hard. Like, people make fun of me all the time. It's like at some point you just gotta go, yeah.
Why would you not walk in the house of a recruiter and be like, hell yeah, it's me? Yeah. Some 18-year-old kid like wanted to play football in college. That's a great story to tell. And he's like, guys, don't say that. Like, I didn't. It just summed it up very well. But again, lack of expectations during the McElwain era kept me from being frustrated entirely with any of those guys. But all right, Will, let's move on to 6 bits here. This one was interesting. Travis May at FF_Travis M on Twitter. He sorted through 15 years of recruiting and NFL draft data. He tracked where players were ranked by a recruiting service and where they ended up being drafted. The major points, I just focus these stats on the guys who were drafted overall, but 58% of the top 25 players were drafted. Of the top 200, the number drops to just under 18%. But for the top 550, it's at 12.5%, and top 800, 7.73% precisely. So, Will, you wrote a great article a couple months back on readandreaction.com. Check it out. It's called the 5-3 theory, where you posited that college staffs should really take the money ball approach toward recruiting by focusing only on the best of the best to 5 stars and then the 3-star guys. So could you break down your 5-3 theory a little further for the audience? And does the Travis May numbers really line up and help your theory, or does it hurt it?
Yeah, so I mean, I only looked at 2013 to 2015, but the numbers that May had basically track with the ones I have, which is that, the guys who are top 15 get drafted like 68% of the time. And then it drops down to around 10% once you get out to the 200th ranked guy. There's not a huge difference between a guy ranked 175 and a guy ranked 575. That's the reality, is in terms of the and it was surprising when I broke it down even further that from the standpoint of like round and where the guy goes, the average round is pretty much the same too. And I think what this indicates is anybody who's got kids has seen their kids in Little League, and the top 2 or 3 kids and who they are the minute they step on the field. Like, they sort of carry themselves differently and they move differently, and the ball's like rocketed to the shortstop if you're talking baseball, and the guy makes a diving stop, you're like, whoa, my kid wouldn't have come within 12 feet of that. And so those guys, and you can see it, and it's visual, and you don't necessarily need numbers to do that. Once you get down to like, the guys in the 150, 250, 350 range, there's a lot more projection. There's a lot more development. So a guy like Desmond Watson, the defensive tackle, the freshman defensive tackle for Florida, is a really big dude. Or Ethan White is a great example where Florida had to project what Ethan White would be, even though he was a 3-star candidate down in like, I think that's 600 or 700 ranking. And the idea is that you have a limited number of resources. You have a finite number of dollars, a finite number of trips you can take, finite number of text messages you can send, all that sort of stuff. And so the 5-3 theory is basically saying, focus it all on the top 50 guys, or if you really want to extend it, the top 100 guys, but I think top 50, and really basically 5 stars. And that's like the top 32, 33, and get as many of those guys as you can, spend a ton of money on those. And then you're the University of Florida. You should be able to bring in with minimal effort guys ranked 400, 500, 600, 700. And, obviously people move around a little bit in the rankings, but the point is that if you're spending a ton of resources on a guy ranked 150th, the chances of him being great really isn't much different than the guy ranked 550th. And so if you're spending 5 times the number of resources on that guy who's ranked 150th, that's just really sort of the wrong approach.
Now, I know what college staffs would say in public, but we saw Barton Simmons from 24/7 Sports just get hired at Vanderbilt as I assume because he's got great connections in the recruiting community, and he's probably thinks about it a little differently. But in general, how much attention do you think these staffs pay to these rankings? And how much of it is built by like these guys, like this guy can afford to go, like, for example, with Trey Lance, right? If you look at a guy like that, how does he fall under the radar? Well, big schools are offering him to play DB or linebacker. He wants to play quarterback. He lives in a place where his parents aren't taking him to the, Elite 11, recruiting camps and stuff. And if you can't afford to do that, or you don't care, you don't bother to do that stuff, you don't get ranked as high. Like, how much of that falls into play? Or is that just, there's always going to be a couple extraneous examples like your Trey Lance's out there?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be examples like that. Bud Elliott had some stuff recently that I thought was really interesting, where he looked at the guys who were 2-star recruits who wound up getting drafted in the NFL draft. Mm-hmm. And what happened was that they were all fast guys who were relatively undersized for their positions. And then they managed to put on weight and or grow taller while maintaining their speed, and that's why they got drafted in the NFL, right? Mm-hmm. So basically the things that the colleges saw and said that's a limitation, they were able to either add weight, add height, without impacting their speed. And how do you project whether a guy who's a 2-star guy is going to be able to put on extra weight and keep his speed or keep his agility, or a guy is going to grow 3 or 4 inches? I mean, we saw this in the NBA a few years ago with Giannis Antetokounmpo. When he comes in the league, he's like 6'8". Now he's 7'1". And so the difference between a 6'8" Giannis and a 7'1" Giannis, I mean, if he'd have been 7'1" at the time, he would have been drafted first overall because of the measurables. And that's the reality is, again, you sort of, the top the top 50, maybe even the top 100 really jump out at you. And at that point, everybody's just a solid football player, and you have to decide what are you going to hang your hat on in terms of the skills you need for your system. And one thing I think is interesting is if you think about a guy like Jonathan Grenard, right? Not really that highly recruited a guy, but he got into the right system with Todd Grantham. And he's got a lot of skill, and certainly, I suspect he's going to do a good job in the NFL for his career. But I do think the fact that he was able to work within Todd Grantham's system probably made a big difference both at Louisville and then when he came to Florida. And had he been in a system where he wasn't allowed to pass rush as much, or he wasn't allowed to utilize some of his quick twitch skills as much, if they'd asked him to hold the edge like a defensive end, then he might have struggled a little bit more. So finding the right niche, finding getting faster while or staying at just as fast while getting bigger, those are the things you got to do. And that's where a guy like Nick Savage really comes in, right? You got to project what's Ethan White going to be like. You got to project what's Desmond Watson going to look like, and you got to project what Trey Lance is going to look like. And you're going to miss sometimes, but that's sort of the whole point of the theory is that if you're going to miss, don't spend a lot of time and energy and dollars on the guys where you're going to hit 10, 12, 15% of the time. Spend the time and energy on those guys who can't miss, because those are the guys who are going to end up winning a championship.
So focus on the clear top guys, and then guys who have the attributes that fit what you're looking for in your system.
Yeah, and who live within a radius of Florida, right? Or a radius of Gainesville. So, the guys who grew up wanting to be Gators, who their offer list maybe isn't Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, and Notre Dame, right? But you can bring them into Florida because they're ranked 600, 700 to 800th. There's not room on the Alabama recruiting class for that guy, but there may be room at Florida, especially if you're bringing in 3 or 4 5-stars every year, and then you need the depth behind it.
Do you think the recruiting strategy dramatically differs from that in terms of, at least geographically, right?
Well, we saw it with Chris Steele a couple of years ago. They were going to California. Now, he was one of those high-level guys that, I think he was ranked like 45th, that you might say, hey, you throw the kids.
He was 5-star, right?
I don't think so. I think he was really high 4-star, but
okay.
But anyway, a high level guy that is playing very well at USC now. And the concern with going to California is it's really hard to bring a guy out of California to Gainesville, and they happen to do it, but then obviously he left before he ever got on the field. I think that's the thing, is that the radius to Florida for anybody other than the really elite players is the thing that you want to watch out for. You want guys who grew up wanting to be Gators so that it doesn't take a ton of energy and effort to get them there. Now, it's not a perfect system, right? Some guy who's ranked 500th in his junior year is going to rise up to be 120th, and maybe you have to give him a little bit more attention. The point is that the guy who rises from 500th to 120th really isn't that much more likely to make it to the NFL than the guy who was 120th, had a rough year and fell down to 550. On a statistical basis, those guys are basically equivalent when it comes to their college production and their NFL draft prospects. And so, if the guy moves up and all of a sudden requires more attention, okay, that's fine. There are other places we can put our attention.
Yeah, we're talking about a massive number of high school football players. There's not a giant, like 300 or 600. Can't be a huge difference between those guys. Like that's
there just isn't statistically. That's the reality is that there's a large difference in the top 15. There's another large difference in the top 50. There's a little bit of a difference once you get to the top 100. And then there's really no difference from there on out in terms of draftability. So it's the same thing where, Moneyball, the whole point was you exploit market inefficiencies by bringing in the guy who hits 220, but walks all the time. Right? Walks all the time and hits home runs. And that was something that didn't get paid in Major League Baseball, which is why that was the guy who was attractive. And the guy who hit 350, everybody knew was good. Right. And so that guy made a ton of money. So if you were on a budget like Oakland was, and you were trying to not get, and you were trying to build a team with budgetary restraints, the thing that you did was you had to say, okay, on base percentage is just as important as batting average. And so I'm not going to pay the guy who makes $20 million a year. I'm going to go get 4 guys who hit, 230, 240, 250, but have on base percentages equivalent to the guy who hits 350, and I'll be better off because of it. That's all we're really saying here is we're saying, when it comes to Barry Bonds, everybody knows you want Barry Bonds on your team, and you pay Barry Bonds because Barry Bonds is worth every dime that you're going to pay him when you have him out there. Or Mike Trout right now is a great example, worth every dime that you're going to pay him. But the problem with the Angels is they have a bunch of really expensive guys who are sort of middling players. And so Trout isn't surrounded by anybody who makes him all that much better, especially in the pitching staff. And the same thing happens in college football where, you might bring in a guy like Gervon Dexter, but if you don't have a bunch of depth behind him to sort of give him a breather and allow him to come off the field and put him in there on really important downs, then is he really going to be able to get the maximum out of his ability? That's sort of what we're saying. And, I'd like to see a team try it. I think Vanderbilt is sort of set up to do that.
They're going to be interesting to watch over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 5-3 works better for a school like Florida, where you're saying, "Hey, we're ranked 9th."
And I think Vandy might be the 3-2, something like that, right?
Well, but again, I mean, Barton Simmons is going to have some idea of how to game the market inefficiencies, and that's all you're trying to do.
I agree.
Is it's pretty clear that if Dan Mullen's going to go head to head with Kirby Smart up against an elite player, that he's either going to have to spend more time with that elite player, or he's probably not going to win the battle. And so you have to sacrifice that time somewhere. And the question is, where are you going to sacrifice it if you really want that elite player?
Last question. Do you put more stock in, you talked about getting guys who grew up wanting to be Gators. Now with the rise of the transfer portal, you have to put a little more stock in geography, right? Being a little closer to home, because if you do get that guy from California and he has a rough freshman year here, probably a higher percentage those guys are going to dip out and head in the transfer portal.
Yeah, I think it depends on pedigree, right? I mean, if it's a can't miss guy from Topeka, you bring him in. If it's a guy who's sort of, good but not great, and you're going to have to do a lot of development work, well, then the fact that he's from Topeka or from Olympia, Washington, or wherever starts to make a difference. And yeah, I think you always want to build a team. I mean, the reality is, if Florida only recruited people from the state of Florida, but they got the best prospects from the state of Florida, the Gators would be awesome. The problem that they have right now is that all the best prospects in the state of Florida are going to Alabama. Like I think it was the top 4 wide receivers this year in the state of Florida went to Alabama. That's a problem.
God, especially South Florida. They're killing it in South Florida.
Yeah, but I mean, again, you got to keep 1 or 2 of those guys. I'm not saying you win every battle against Alabama, but what I'm saying is that if you're fighting Georgia, Alabama, and Clemson for a guy ranked 150th, let him go. Take your resources, apply that to the guy that you're battling Alabama and Clemson and Georgia on, who's ranked 25th, and then just cascade down. And there's plenty of players in the state of Florida who are good, who are either undersized or who could use some development, or maybe even oversized, depending upon the guy. And Mullen seems to be very, very good at finding those diamonds in the rough. So let's embrace that, right? Let's embrace the fact that development and on-field acumen are his strength, that recruiting doesn't seem to be. And so instead of fighting that, let's try to find the market inefficiency and build from there.
All right, let's move on to $1. Pulled this from an article by Demetrius Harvey over at SI.com. All Gators. He says, according to sportsbettingdime.com, the Gators have a current over-under win total of 8 wins. The highest in the SEC is Alabama at 11. Georgia's got 9.5. Texas A&M is at 9. And really, so the Gators are sitting at 4th in the SEC behind those teams on expected win total. In terms of a national title, the Gators are at plus 5,600 behind Texas, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, Iowa State, Oklahoma, Georgia, Ohio State, Clemson, and of course, Roll Tide Alabama is at plus 400. Will, how you feeling about those national title odds? And I think I like the over on the 8 wins.
I mean, so I think the over under, well, the national title odds and the over under, and you're obviously an Emory Jones disciple, but it's all about how well Emory plays, right? If Emory plays well, they lose close to Alabama, they're going to blow the doors off of Tennessee and at Kentucky, and then they got Vanderbilt before they have to go at LSU. I think that starts to make a difference, but you can see, the path is there for it to be a nightmare of a season. If remember 2013 or no, it was 2010 was an awful year because they had John Brantley go down with an ankle injury against Alabama, and then Driscoll got hurt in that game too. And all of a sudden now you got your top 2 quarterbacks limping around. And then when it started, it just sort of started going downhill from there. So, that's where with the quarterbacks who are dual threat, and you're going to have to use Emory Jones to run around to beat Alabama, that's where it starts to sort of I wonder whether Emory Jones is big enough to make his way through that entire schedule. And then you start looking at Alabama. Okay, it's a home game. Everybody's hyped up. And then the next weekend you're against Tennessee. Tennessee has a whole new system coming in, so you don't expect them to be that good. But then you're at Kentucky the week after. And that's sort of –
it's always a tough game.
It's a tough game. Kentucky's a solid program. They're not great, but they're a solid program. And, it's going to depend on how banged up you are coming into that. So, I think 8 wins is probably – I don't think they hit 8. I think it's either well above. I think it's either 9 or 10, or I think the whole season sort of goes south and you end up below 8. But I understand why they set it at 8, because it's really – I had somebody send me something the other day. It was a chart that showed the possible distributions of what Emory Jones' play could look like, and it was anywhere from Treon Harris all the way to Kyle Trask. And that was sort of the whole box. And that's the deal.
So educational.
Well, but it was interesting because it basically said that the floor is pretty bad, right? There's an opportunity to have a bad floor, but there's an opportunity to have a really high ceiling.
Let me get this straight. He's either going to be really bad or really good.
Well,
is that the distribution?
Yeah, but it was based on his running the running yards he's already put up, right? And the point he was making to me,
factoring in both.
Well, the point that he was making to me is that I have said that I think Emory Jones's floor is higher because he has the ability to be a dual threat, and he's already shown very good vision when he's running the ball. His point is that just because he runs the ball doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily be great. Just look at Treon. So that has tempered my expectations a little bit, but we'll see. Mullen hasn't let him do it yet. I think he can. I think he threw the ball off of a bunch of guys' hands against Oklahoma, and we'll see if they put guys out there who can bring it in next year.
I think we've seen enough to know that he can throw the ball better than Treon Harris. I think we did. But thanks for bringing up 2010 again, Will. That was great. Good memories.
That's what I'm here for, buddy.
Good memories, man. All right, hey, this has been another episode of Stand Up and Holler. We appreciate y'all joining us here. Be sure to subscribe to Read and Reaction. We really upped the subscribers the last couple weeks. Thank you for everybody for pressing that button. And be sure if you still haven't, go out and do it. Will, you're on Patreon too. You want to plug Patreon for a sec?
Yeah, so we do bonus episodes of this every week. If you go to patreon.com/read and reaction, you support us there. There will be weekly or bi-weekly, depending upon the level of topics, videos where we do a little bit more extended version of what we do here. And then certainly anything that I do that's sort of outside of the normal read and reaction stuff goes up there as well. So appreciate people checking that out. And then if you just subscribe to the YouTube channel, that's completely free. But as Nick said, we're up to 600. We really want to get up to 1,000 before the season starts. That helps us out immensely. So if you just click on the like and subscribe button, that helps us out. And we appreciate it.
Hey, Will, June, we're getting closer to football season. It's getting there, man.
Almost there. The magazines are out. The magazines are out, and it's time to get going, man. The juices are starting to flow a little bit.
All right, for Will Miles, I'm Nick Knutson. Go Gators.
Go Gators.
Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel. Join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.